To the east of Uthowpaba in the Athergalth are the Twin Peninsulas, also known as God's Feet or simply the Far East. It is a land of sprawling, rolling hills, farmlands, grasslands, streams, sparse forests, common rains, and rocky coasts. To the cartographers of Eathkink and scholars who are geographically inclined, the East is generally seen as the most pleasant climate of the entire continent. The Far East, though lacking in any great conflicts or movements like the cultures in the West, is still a land full of intrigue, unique cultures, and vivid histories. It is there where a peculiar form of civilization ebbs and flows. The Far East is a region not governed by any nation-state or city-state or any manner of king or theocrat, but rather by many scattered and decentralized familial and individual estates, if anything. To best understand the thought process, reasoning, and organization of the Twin Peninsulas and why it is the way that it is, it's best to understand the horribly misunderstood religious values and subsequent cultural beliefs of the Eastern people. To everyone but themselves, the Eastern people are said to either be completely atheist, agnostic, or that they worship Ormurigj, also known as selfism, the belief that they themselves are gods. All of these claims are gross misconceptions that further lead to the ostracization of the East by the rest of the people on Uthowpaba, who generally tend to be far more zealous in their faiths. The truth is that they tend to believe in a religion truly known as A-inorearch, though the Eastern people don't often see their beliefs as being equivalent to a true religion. The basics is that they believe in one singular deity known as Ormurigj, and that Ormurigj, when he created the world and the Angau people upon it, died in the process in a great sacrifice. Now, the soul, the spirit, the Uther of Ormurigj lives on through the Angau. This is why the Angau, and no other animal, is capable of complex thought, artistic expression, creation, and invention. Within the A-inorearch faith, the Eastern people do not worship Ormurigj directly. They do not build temples or read holy texts, because why would they? Their god is dead. Instead, they believe in practicing the gift of creation that was bestowed upon them as the children of the Creator himself. They also believe that, just as they were blessed with creation, so too are they cursed to die like Ormurigj, and as such they have a limited time to forge their legacy and fulfill their dreams and ambitions. This is one of the main reasons for the great ambitions, ruthless competition, cutthroat intrigue, and rugged individualism of the Twin Peninsulas. There is often contention within the Eastern people to whether or not there are other pieces of Ormurigj's Uther that exists either within animals, plants, or in a more non-corporeal form. Assuming parts of his Uther can exist in an ethereal form, it's believed that just as the Angau have their own personalities, ambitions, and agencies, so too do the spiritual remnants of Ormurigj, and that these spiritual remnants have some degree of otherworldly power and are seen in other faiths as the various gods, but that they are nothing more than greater and more powerful spirits and cannot truly be considered as deities. Only Ormurigj truly holds that title. The Eastern people's belief that there is only a single deity who is ultimately dead, and their lack of any holy texts or obvious forms of worship, is what gives the impression that they are atheistic in nature. On and around the Twin Peninsulas, what a person, or often their entire family, owns, be that a specific tract of land, a building or business of any sort, or any kind of asset, even if it's something as mundane as a shovel or shirt, is deemed as being their estate, and they are the sole authority of how their property is managed. There is no king, governor, senator, or any other kind of government or priestly caste dictating laws or collecting taxes above the authority of an estate. This often meant very little. A simple homeowner in a village or a small farmer likely wouldn't even bother with any sort of politics of this kind, like setting some sort of laws, let alone enforcing them, yet for the larger, wealthier, and influential estates, their authority toed the line of proper governance. The most notable individuals and families of the East made up what can best be described as the nobility of the region, and they often called the shots of what happened on their land from their more literal estate, as in a mansion, chateau, or villa. The size of one's place of residence was an important status symbol on the Twin Peninsulas, and often the larger, grander mansions equated with the power and influence of its residents. The lands of the east were often speckled by almost comically large mansions, some new, some old, most crumbled and ruined. This tends to give an often misinterpreted double meaning to the idea of estate governance. Consider a brief hypothetical. A successful farmer who owns some fertile land decides to use his wealth to build a grand villa upon his property as a symbol. This farmer, who has sole authority of what is done on his land, decides to allow his workers to make their own small houses around his villa for the sake of convenience, as long as they pay a small fee for the use of the land. Now that more people are lumped into this land, the farmer may allow someone to build an inn to house more people and to provide food, drink, and some entertainment, so long as they too pay a fee. Now maybe a blacksmith comes along to mend the tools, or a cobbler to mend work boots, or a weaver to make and mend clothes, or a baker to turn the wheat the farmer grows into flour and bread. And now far more people are congregated upon the farmer's land, making it a target to more malicious groups. As such, the farmer may now have to use his wealth to hire mercenaries to guard his property. Crime may now become a minor issue, so the farmer may now outlaw swords or even alcohol on his property to cut down on altercation. The farmer may also prohibit hunting on his property, or charge a fee for merchants to use the road on his land, etc. Now, the once farmer has instead accidentally created a small town and became a minor lord of sorts, collecting tax in the form of rent, setting rules for what can and cannot be done on his sovereign property, and hiring mercenaries to act as a standing army for enforcing and protecting from outside forces. This is how towns and villages work in the East. Estates, large or small, were often judged by how generational the family estate was, not just because older estates tended to be the wealthiest, most stable, and most successful, but because estates had a tendency not to last long, and wealth could be lost just as quickly as gained. Families and individuals die out over time, new competition rises, mercenaries or roving gangs of bandits may kick down your door, or if you're too ambitious, local estates may hire assassins or form coalitions and confederacies against you. This also applies if an estate was engaging in unsocially acceptable behavior. Technically, on your own estate you could butcher people and engage in cannibalism if you so chose, or any other such distasteful actions, but in practicality, if anybody was caught engaging in such behaviors, they were often killed quickly and without remorse as more of an overarching cultural rule. There were many checks and balances to the power structure of the East, and most of it was horribly cutthroat, yet the downfall of an estate was a gap to be filled by new ambition. In the absence of centralized governance and a proper, stable noble class, the warrior caste took a prominent role in society. Where standing armies couldn't be raised, soldiers instead could be purchased to guard towns or wage wars on other estates, and the largest armies were easily those of mercenary companies, whose powers stretched far across the East. Wars were often fought not by the individual members of an estate, but by these third parties. Leaders of these mercenary companies were some of the wealthiest estates in the East. They often toed the line with being a part of the merchant class instead on account of their wealth and the nature of their service. Leaders of mercenary estates often never even appeared in battle themselves, but instead they engaged much more in tactics, management, and accounting. On the less savory side of the warrior caste, roving bands of raider, pirate, and bandit warlords often led explosive but short-lived lives, taking what they wanted by force. Save for the mercenary groups, nothing could stand in the way of their brutality and numbers. When this happened, estates often formed coalitions and confederacies to pool resources to raise what little of a fighting force that they could, or to hire more mercenaries. Fortunately, the mercenary gangs often outmanned and outarmed the bandits, so the more civilized sections of the Twin Peninsulas rarely saw conflict of this kind, save for pirates that constantly disrupted trade. But even then, there were many mercenary groups that specialized in naval warfare, who were often hired to guard convoys of merchant ships and ports. Though the warrior caste was of extreme importance and power in the East, undeniably the merchant class was the most influential, and the sophistication of Eastern economics, even during the Twilight Era, was staggering. Merchant caravans and trade routes were extensive. Metal was taken from Gyupi, Ahi Air, and the other lesser copper kingdoms of the Ormurigj Mountains. Lumber was taken from the Uthowpaba Apakual, agricultural products were taken from the Toyot River, cattle, sheep, goats, and other animals grazed in the rolling hills, producing various animal products, fish were taken from the coast, and so on. All of these raw materials were funneled into the more urban regions of God's Feet, where vast industries would work on refining these goods. The merchants would then take these refined goods and sell them back to the farmers, miners, lumberjacks, fishermen, and so forth all across the East, creating a fairly reliable and lucrative back and forth trade relationship between the rural and urban sections of the East. Where being so decentralized, much of the Eastern industry was concentrated into very few places. The East also had economic practices still rarely seen elsewhere. Cereal production, fractional investment in ships and other businesses, convoy tactics on both land and sea, standardized parts and measurements, and so forth. All of this turned the Far East into an economic and industrial hotspot in the best of times, but the constant instability and lawlessness had a tendency to curtail much of the potential. But the barter system still generally reigned supreme in most areas. The East also had a few different currencies being used that no doubt contributed to the smooth growth and transfer of wealth. On the coast, they used specific kinds of seashells. Around the Uthowpaba, they would use tally sticks. On the northern peninsula, they used special green beads, and around the Ormurigj mountains, they would use lumps of raw metal. Despite a few different working currencies, the large merchant groups would often compensate, honor, and adapt to these changes, lessening the issues and allowing for constant trade despite the differences. Of all of the different organized groups in the Twin Peninsulas, none were greater than the elusive Cult of Eternal War. This odd cult was a mercenary company with scattered chapters all throughout the Twin Peninsulas. These different chapters, despite sharing the same symbolism and intent, had rarely any direct affiliation and communication with each other, making each chapter largely independent of one another. The largest of these chapters was located on the island fortress of Azalseek, the unofficial headquarters of the Cult of Eternal War. Azalseek was an impenetrable bastion from invasion, but for trade and diplomacy, it was wide open for all. Merchant ships would come to trade frequently on the island, and the more wealthy estates would often come to hire them to conduct warfare or even to mediate issues. In the center of the island of Azalseek was a large metal statue depicting a woman, a pseudo-deity named Ormurigj, a figure who was less of a proper goddess and more of a personification of war and luck. Whenever a member of the Eternal War cult is asked who their leader is, they always claim it's Ormurigj, and many of the female chapter leaders often take up the name of Ormurigj as more of a title, often in mild jest. Within stories told by the Cult of Eternal War in the Twin Peninsulas at large, Ormurigj is often mentioned in stories relating to warfare as an embodiment of war, even though no Ormurigj was ever present. The aesthetic of the Cult of Eternal War is also rather unique, with their armors often being spiked with large needle-like additions, and they always wear combinations of red, yellow, and blue. They also use often tessellating symbols of teardrops and feminine motifs as a reference to Ormurigj, with many members of the Cult of Eternal War carrying with them carved figures of Ormurigj as a token of good luck. The Eternal War cult seems to have no apparent motive, and they can be seen fighting with or against local estates, small or large, paid or otherwise, for no explained motive save for the love of battle. It's not uncommon for members of the cult to appear unannounced in battles without invitation, nor is it uncommon for different chapters of the cult to fight each other on different sides of the same conflict. Even lone individuals in the cult often travel to the east, offering their services to anyone who may request it. The Cult of Eternal War also has a special religious artifact known as the Lucky Sword of the Spider, a sword given to Ormurigj by an unknown individual on the Toyat River in exchange for some food. The spider mentioned in the sword is usually connected to a certain deity in Toyat River myths who is a divine figure of chaos and fear. Many also equate the spider to being Ormurigj herself, but reinterpreted by a separate culture. Either way, the Far Eastern people, and even the Eternal War cult, don't even widely believe in these deities. The Lucky Sword of the Spider was an artifact that changed many hands throughout history, and it has a mythic and unexplained status similar to Ormurigj in the way in which they both appear without explanation in old stories. The Cult of Eternal War is also believed to have existed for a very, very long time, with their symbols and colors being found scattered all across ancient ruins on the Twin Peninsulas, even on skeletons in ancient and largely untouched ruins. Even though the intentions of the Eternal War Cult seem scattered, illogical, and bland, they have had an invested interest in the lost city of Mihamel, which they invaded several times both before and after the destruction of the ancient city. Rumors and speculation claims that certain powerful members of the Cult of Eternal War used the mechanisms within the towers of Mihamel to ordain and even change the outcomes of the future and to speak to powerful deities to an unknown end. Even after the eventual rise and fall of the Far East during the Dawn Era, this elusive group always remains in some way. Though the East was so decentralized, there were 3 places in the Twilight Era that could adequately be called cities: the A-inorearch, Achotha, and Mihamel. The creation of the A-inorearch is a rather underwhelming one, caused merely by ideal geography. Where the main body of Achotha breaks off into the Ormurigj peninsula, the land briefly thins out into a sort of causeway, making it the only viable path of travel between Ormurigj and the rest of the continent by land. This, coupled with lucrative fishing industries and thus ports on either end of the region, made it a perfect trade hub. Merchants, armies, and any other travelers in the region would go back and forth through the causeway, making it a prominent trade hub both on land and on the water. People just naturally flocked to the A-inorearch and stayed around, building houses, starting industries, etc. There was never one specific moment or pivotal founder. The A-inorearch just gradually happened. There wasn't ever a single A-inorearch either. Rather, there were many smaller nearby settlements that gradually grew together into becoming a major city. Thanks to their mercantile history, the A-inorearch trade routes became very sophisticated, and it became a haven for artisans and skilled laborers who would use imported raw goods to produce all manner of finished products to be exported back, creating a much-needed industrial center and lucrative back-and-forth trade that helped to not only develop the A-inorearch, but anybody else within its economic influence. Due to the nature of the A-inorearch in the East as a whole, the city was almost comically decentralized. From block to block and road to road, the ruling estate and thus governance would change. Laws were largely non-existent and shifted constantly, with the one constant being a loose meritocracy and no-nonsense cultural undertones that frowned heavily upon any manner of murder, theft, and so forth, especially when such crimes were often met with whatever kind of punishment the offended or the paid mercenary guards wished. The A-inorearch was so decentralized that depending on which part of the city you were in, entire cultures and even languages would change. Walking through the city often felt like walking through multiple cities at once, as if multiple places were plucked from existence and squished into one place. The only binding tradition of the A-inorearch is the lighting of the East Star, a strange mechanism of glass, mirrors, and glass pipes, all jutting from a single fireplace. The fire in the fireplace, according to tradition, may never, under any circumstance, go out, though the people who adhered to the tradition long since forgot why. The glass and mirrors were all said to accentuate and scatter the light of the fire, lighting up the city even at night. Other than the A-inorearch, there was also Achotha, a much more traditional city. Achotha itself existed for quite a while in a small and insignificant state, and it wouldn't be a prominent location until Uthowpaba, a prominent warlord, conquered it and made it his new home. Uthowpaba was notoriously proficient in 2 types of spears, the first to end life and the other to create it, and he is known mostly not for his proclivities for warfare, but for his many children. Uthowpaba instilled into his many children a deep love and appreciation for family, and encouraged them, no matter what they wished to do in life, to stick together and help one another. Even once Uthowpaba died and his children grew up and split off, the Uthowpaba estate stood strong. His children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would all become mercenaries, merchants, farmers, shepherds, fishermen, milliners, masons, cobblers, coopers, and any other sort of profession, yet they all stuck together. The city of Achotha remained a city very firmly under the control of the Uthowpaba estate, with no possible opposition, even as it grew into a wealthy and populous city. The Uthowpaba family became the only Grand Eastern dynasty, and they always kept track of their bloodline and family tree, starting with Uthowpaba himself. Although many other minor estates existed in Achotha, none dare oppose anyone if they were in the Uthowpaba estate, whose words were law both within Achotha and the immediate area around it. Unlike the rest of the East, Achotha's nepotism and strong familial union made it the only mostly centralized region on all of the Twin Peninsulas, a boon that made them very strong even past the Twilight Era and into the Dawn Era. The last major city of the Far East during the Twilight Era was much more elusive, that being the city of Mihamel. Mihamel rose and fell far back during the Twilight Era, but few, often embellished records remain. Built on the easternmost point of Uthowpaba, the city was not of the same culture as the rest of the Twin Peninsulas. It's said that the people of Mihamel built towers of stone and iron, with glittering designs of jade and aquamarine built in imitation of the jade towers. They also had sophisticated mechanisms of gears, cogs, and axles in these great towers that were said to alter the course of time and receive communication from gods, and many of their cultural motifs, including any tools, armor, weapons, furniture, and jewelry, had strong mechanical symbols and shapes, even if they didn't function in any sophisticated manner. The exact fate of Mihamel isn't entirely certain, but most accounts claim that Mihamel was either destroyed in a great battle or that it sunk into the sea, even sometimes both at the same time, and even the eastern people, who aren't prone to fanciful tales, claim a serpentine or squid-like leviathan dragged the city into the sea. Though Mihamel was wiped off the map, many of its spires remain jutting out of the ocean, and many years after the city was originally destroyed, many of the towers were reclaimed. The upper portions of the towers were gutted of anything valuable and turned into homes, while the lower, waterlogged portions still remain untouched to this day. Around these towers, platforms of planks and pontoons allowed for traversal between, and a large settlement, although not very influential, was rebuilt on its remains. In the Far East, there is also a worrisome concept known as the city on city, or city on city on city. The East, as is to be expected by the rise and fall of the many scattered estates, is filled up with ruins. Old stonework litters the landscape, overgrown, crumbling, and long since abandoned. Yet among these ruins are some that seem much older, much more ancient, much more sophisticated, and of a distinctly separate culture. Yet their origins are unaccounted for, and their breadth and scale are seemingly much larger than anything the fragmented East could realistically create. There are also theories that say the aforementioned cities were all built atop of other, even more ancient cities, thus the name of the city on city. For instance, both the A-inorearch and Achotha have spiraling, maze-like catacombs beneath their cities that are neither mapped nor accounted for. Even the East Star doesn't have a known origin or reasoning behind it, despite it being an A-inorearch tradition, and many of the glass plates and mirrors shine into sections of the underground tunnels of the city that have long since been blocked off, abandoned, and unaccounted for. The East also used what they called warped metal, the Eastern name of what we now know as iron and steel, two types of metal impossible to fully work with during the Twilight Era due to a lack of knowledge on the processes needed to melt them down. Ancient warped metal goods were scavenged from old ruins or found buried in fields and repurposed. These metal goods were then, since they could not be melted down without significant difficulty, instead stripped of the rust, and the dents and nicks were then pounded out as straight as possible or intentionally worsened. What was once a substantial chunk taken from a sword was now part of a serrated edge, or now that sword was instead a dagger. What was once a dented helmet was now instead a bowl. The possibilities seemed only greater with the limitations that the metal brought. These refurbished metal pieces could generally be a bit weak and hard to use on account of their unideal manufacturing, or rather refurbishing process, but they sufficed well enough considering that the much more practical copper and tin from the Ormurigj mountains was halfway across the continent. Even to this day, Eastern goods are often serrated, wavy, and lumpy as if they were broken and fixed, or are scratched into patterns like a crude form of embossment, all as a cultural remnant from the days of warped metal.